Okay, good evening. Welcome to the KRUX podcast, where we interview a speaker that was presenting at our regular KRUX Thursdays. And it gives us an opportunity to analyze the topic in a bit more depth, to revisit some of the important thoughts and ideas that came up at the session. And then it's also a way for us to connect with our members who couldn't be present in the lounge in person when the speaker was presenting. So a couple of weeks ago, we had Dr. J.P. Harper, who was presenting on his doctoral dissertation that has now been published as a book on Paul and Philo on the politics of land, Jerusalem, and temple. And we definitely thought that it was worth revisiting this. So it is a privilege to welcome Dr. Harper to the podcast. So JP, hi.
Hi, Lishan. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for your extra time, not only with your family responsibilities and your work responsibilities, where you're able to present for us at KRUX, but now we even have you for another while in this evening. So thank you for making the time to chat to us about your topic. So
Sure.
I met you as a minister in Christ Church in Stellenbosch, but when you read your CV and find out about J.P. Harper a bit more, you see it's just degrees in mathematics. Now, how did you do this unexpected career change from science to ministry?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. I find myself in my early 20s really enjoying studying, and particularly mathematics. I was fascinated by it, by just the simple questions that you could ask a child, really, questions about prime numbers, and yet profound questions at the same time that mathematicians still struggle with. So yeah, I went on to study a master's and investigated a problem that Gauss first proposed in the 19th century related to number fields and class numbers. And at that same time, I was really enjoying my studies, but I was also really wrestling with ultimate questions. Can I really believe sort of the Christian faith in which I was raised? Many of my friends were atheists, and they asked some challenging questions. And so that sort of led me really to a search and reading a lot, particularly C.S. Lewis, some of his apologetic works, Mere Christianity, Miracles, had pointed me to G.K. Chesterton. At the same time, I don't know how I first got in contact with this, but I started reading the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins, Christian Victorian poet. And through all these different ways, God was speaking to me, through people at church as well, just taking an interest in my life and, asking, will I read the Bible with them, and reading some of Jesus's challenging teaching in the Sermon on the Mount and some of his radical demands there. I came to a point where I realized that there were compelling reasons intellectually to accept the claims of Jesus. But then I began to also realize that part of me also didn't want to believe that it was true. I wanted to live life my own way. And so there were some big decisions I had to make. If this really is true, I need to center my life around Jesus. And I suppose it's a challenge, and it's an ongoing challenge. But it was a particular challenge I faced at that point as well. But yeah, I also sort of realized that if Jesus really is who he claimed to be, that to follow him is actually the good life. And so, yeah, there was a period in my early sort of mid-20s where I really made that decision, sort of owned the faith in which I was raised, and increasingly became involved in the church. And yeah, I had this increasing desire to teach, and increasingly got opportunities to teach Bible studies, got opportunities to preach, and that led eventually to me going to study theology a few years down the line as well. I worked a couple of years, and then I went to study my bachelor's in theology. And during my time as a minister, I also pursued further postgraduate theological study as well. That's the medium-length version of the story.
And that's how you ended up in ministry. And then what ultimately made you decide to carry on all the way to PhD? What led you to your topic?
Yeah, so Yeah, various things. I think I felt a need for deeper reflection on the Bible. I found there were many questions that I couldn't answer. I had a good framework from my undergraduate studies, but I really wanted to go deeper. And particularly, the real question of application. I found often the application to be quite shallow, and even my own as well. We need to pray more, go to church more, read our Bibles more, all the standard things. But what does the gospel really mean for our economic lives, our political lives, and really every sphere of life? If Christ is Lord, and if he's the creator God, then surely his word has something to say about all of life. And so that led me down a path of pursuing further study. Some of my earlier studies in my honors year and so on, I became interested in the question of land, as you mentioned earlier. You've got this great promise so intimately tied to the covenant, the promise of land to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, and then of course, to Israel. And really the question is, what has become of that promise in the New Testament? Has that been abandoned? Has it been spiritualized towards heaven? And so I really explored that, and looking particularly at Paul as well. As you well know, the further you go in postgraduate studies, the more you have to narrow your focus. So I couldn't just ask that question broadly on the whole New Testament, but what does Paul particularly have to say on this question? And that was gradually broadened into my PhD thesis, looking at really the Jewish conceptualization of sacred space. There was this idea in the rabbis of concentric degrees of holiness. If I recall one of the Mishnahs correctly, it speaks about 10 degrees of holiness. The promised land is more holy than all other lands. And so as you come in closer and closer, then the holy city is more holy than the land. And then finally, the temple is even more holy. And then like right there in the center, in the Holy of Holies, is the most holy place. And so you had this idea of sacred space, of land, Jerusalem, temple, from which God ruled. And so I sort of broadened my focus to focus on these three important symbols. And I can keep going. I also realized that, if I want to study Paul as a first century Jew, how am I going to appreciate the richness of his perspective on these areas better? Well, I should really compare him. What did other first century Jews believe about these symbols of the land, Jerusalem, and temple? And eventually I settled on Philo for various reasons. So that's what my dissertation ended up being, a comparative study of Paul and Philo's views on these three symbols.
And congratulations on getting it published in such an excellent format. So I recently got the ChatGPT version with the browser extension. I've been waiting for the browser access for so long. And one of the first things I did was see if ChatGPT with browser could pick up your book. And I was so excited to see that I could ask it questions about it. And so if anybody's watching and wants the clip notes, I think it
can probably summarize my book better than I can. So go and ask it.
I was very impressed. But for maybe somebody that doesn't have a browser plugin access yet, or who just wants a layman's understanding, can you just summarize again for us what your research question was? And so just in simple terms, so somebody could understand what your study was about.
Sure. So I was comparing Paul and Philo's perspective on these three very important first century Jewish symbols of the land, Jerusalem, and temple. And as my title suggests, I draw particular attention to their political significance. And I suppose that also arose out of my own thought on the subject. And one of the areas, as a minister myself, that I'm interested in is the whole question of authority and where where does final authority lie? And really what I argue in the book is that these categories were important for Jews and the way that they thought about authority. The land, firstly, as a symbol, really raised the question of, who ultimately owns the earth? Who ultimately is Lord? Is it Caesar ruling from Rome? Does the land actually belong to him, as the Romans claimed? But what about the promise that God had made to the people of God to be heirs of this land? And so the question of land raises that political question. And so I argue that we get some insight into how Paul in the first century thought about the promises of God and something of his political theology and stance towards the powers. And the same thing for Philo as well. He was an aristocratic Jew, wealthy, well-educated, from Alexandria, and he tends to downplay the land in many ways. In many ways, I argue, as others have done before me as well, to avoid confrontation with Rome. Of course, it's a contentious question to say that this land belongs to us. Eventually, it led to the Jewish-Roman War, of course, in AD 66 to AD 70. The other symbols, Jerusalem, the temple, I argue that those are also political in some sense. One of my important research questions and areas of interest was, how is there any central governing authority for the church? Is there a normative pattern in the New Testament? I guess that's the broader question behind it. I belong to a network of churches today. There's so many different networks of churches. Is there a normative pattern in the New Testament? And really, we can expect, the early church to really have got many of its models from Judaism, from the Jewish synagogue. And the symbol of Jerusalem really raised the question of how were the synagogues that were now, of course, spread throughout the Roman Mediterranean world, how were they related to one another? Was there some kind of central hierarchy in Jerusalem? The high priesthood, did the high priests send out regulations that were to be obeyed by Jews living in all these different communities widely spread out? And the answer I found there was actually the connection was in some ways strong. All Jews looked back to Jerusalem as their homeland, but in other ways, in terms of sort of political authority, quite weak. And there was a fair degree of independence for all these Jewish communities. And I argue really that Paul, in many ways, sort of got his model for thinking about the church that spread out geographically from drawing on these Jewish roots. Of course, the church in Jerusalem is quite significant to Paul. It's really the birthplace of Christianity. That's where Jesus had died. That's where all the founding apostles, where Peter, where James, where John were. And so the Jerusalem church played a very important role. And yet also Paul didn't sort of allow it of an ultimate authority to define the gospel. So I spent quite a lot of time exploring Paul's view on Jerusalem as well. And the temple, similarly, I argue, particularly from Paul's letter his first letter to the Corinthians, that Paul had quite a strong view of congregational authority, the church as the new temple, and that every believer now in the new age, the age of the Messiah, has been given God's Spirit, and that the church together is the new temple, essentially. And so I draw out aspects of Paul and Philo's theology. I look particularly at their perspective on charismatic theology. I draw a bit on Max Weber, the German sociologist, on his taxonomy of authority, traditional authority, rational authority, and charismatic authority. And I explore Paul and Philo from those angles. I've gone on a little bit there, but those are a few of the key areas that I looked at.
That's such a unique approach, because your PhD was specifically in New Testament studies, right?
Yes, it was. It was. Yeah. So look, I also argue that often we can sort of impose our own categories on the first century, and so I deliberately wanted to look at these categories that were already important to them, and see if there's something in those categories that speaks to this question of how they would have conceptualized authority. Yeah.
Sure, well done, very well scoped. It's such a concise research question and so interesting. So very, very well scoped.
Well, when I thought about it, I realized, no, this is going to go well. When I finally sort of when I sort of brought it all together, I knew it was gonna fly. You know, I think many people, when they're doing their PhD research, you sort of a touch and go, and have you got that right angle? You know, I guess you need to find an angle and do something that's novel. And
that unique
I was very, very grateful when I sort of when that crystallized. Yeah,
because I remember, I think I heard you speak on Paul and land. That's kind of where it started, maybe as far back as 2016. And I don't know if you remember, we invited you to come speak to us when we still had hot dogs and dialogues at East Mountain.
Yes.
And that was the first time that I heard you speak, especially on the topic of land. So back then, my head was so full of nonsense theology. I was still deep in John Bevere's Driven by Eternity, and had all of these visions about just a disembodied spirit on a cloud playing harp forever, or standing around in a hall singing forever. And that was my idea of eternity. So I remember just that aha moment when you started exploring Paul and land specifically, and I thought, what is happening? I recite the Apostles' Creed, and then I make so little of the physical resurrection, and I make so little of land and inheritance. So especially because, you know, we've really been exploring embodiment at KRUX this year. That's why I invited you back to KRUX, to just come tell us the rest of the story that you started in 2016 again. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit on especially the land section, just because we are trying to think through topics of place and land and inheritance and ownership. So can you maybe just summarize the two different views that you then contrast? What does Paul mean when he says land? How does Philo think about land? How do they think about ownership and inheritance?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose when you start asking the question, you know, this is such an important theme in biblical faith, and you start asking the question, you start wondering, so where does Paul actually speak about it? And I think the key really is to investigate, as you've said already, the terminology of inheritance. So really what sparked my thinking in this area was some of N.T. Wright's work, some of his early work, The Climax of the Covenant. He's written a lot more now in Paul and the Faithfulness of God, which I draw on quite a bit. There are a number of other scholars who've developed it further. But is that language of inheritance? In Greek, the kleronomos word group, kleronomeo, to inherit, which is really the Greek translation of the Old Testament language used for the land. God gives the people of Israel the land as their inheritance. And when you put it that way, you actually see that Paul actually has quite a lot to say about inheritance. And one of the key verses that N.T. Wright looks at is Romans 4:13. That's looking back to Abraham. Of course, the covenant was made with Abraham, the promise of land. And Paul says there about Abraham, it was not through the law that Abraham was given the promise that he would be heir, not of the land, the gay would be the natural Greek word, but the kleronomos to cosmu, the heir of the cosmos, the world. That's often translated Romans 4:13. And so what Paul is doing there is he's actually showing us how he thinks about that promise made to Abraham in Romans 4. And the way he thinks about it is actually that promise was always intended to signify something bigger. That promise was always that the whole world would be blessed through Abraham, ultimately through Christ, who comes from Abraham's line. But what is it that the people of God, what place are they going to enjoy this new covenant relationship with God in? Well, it's not just in the land of Palestine. It's actually in the world. It's in the cosmos. And so that is Paul's horizon. And actually, you can see it as well in Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, where he says the meek will inherit not the land, but the meek will inherit the earth. And so, there are a few other places in Paul where he goes a little bit deeper. If you keep on reading Romans and you come to Romans 8, he again uses the language of being heirs. In Romans 8, you are heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. Very interesting language of sort of sharing in the rule of the Messiah. And it was another scholar by the name of Mark Foreman who really helped me to see the connections there in Romans 8. We often separate it. Paul speaks, from verse 15 onwards, that God's given us his Spirit by whom we cry, Abba, Father. And he goes on to say, we are heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. If indeed we share in his sufferings, that we may share in his glory. And what is that language of glory? Well, it takes us right back to Genesis, to Adam, created in the image and the glory of God. And what does he go on to talk about in Romans 8, verse 18 onwards? Well, it's about the resurrection. It's about the new creation. The whole present creation is groaning as in pains of childbearing. And he goes on to speak about this new, that the creation itself will be liberated and set free from its bondage to decay. Those wonderful words. And there again, we have this very strong view that, it's not, as you were saying earlier, Paul doesn't have this vision of, believers. His longing is not to be sort of taken up into the spiritual realm, but it's for the renewal of creation. The creation itself, in the Greek, that's emphasized in the Greek, autothesis. The creation itself will be liberated and set free from its bondage. And so, I think that in a nutshell is Paul's vision, a new world through Jesus' victory over death and through his resurrection. And so that is really the promised land that Paul longs for. So Philo is interesting. I think, like many of us, he embodies certain contradictions. Often his stated philosophy or theology isn't quite how he lives. So in a lot of his writings, he spiritualizes the land. The land is heaven. It's the heavenly city. And so therefore we shouldn't worry too much about, what happens in the world, because we're heading towards heaven. So in some sense, you would think that his theology would lead him there. But in another sense, he actually is concerned about the world, and he's concerned about the abuse and the persecution of Jews in his native city of Alexandria. He's actually appointed as a delegate after some riots in Alexandria. He's appointed as a delegate to go to the Roman emperor to appeal for justice. Many of the Jewish homes had been ransacked and all their goods taken, and so he goes to the Roman emperor to appeal for justice. And he wrote a whole treatise on that, which is quite a fascinating read. And so in a sense, he risks his life as well, because he's quite bold in sort of laying these requests before the emperor. And Caius Caligula wasn't well known for being very diplomatic. If he had said something out of place, he could have easily been fed to the lions or something. And so in some sense, he's willing to risk his life for his people. But so that's where Philo is at. In my book, I sort of go into greater length, and I also look at how he clearly alludes, when he's reflecting on some of the biblical promises of the land. He sort of clearly dislikes of the Roman boast that they are rulers of everything, and he says, actually, no, it's the people of God who are the true rulers, but they're kind of the rulers on a spiritual plane. They sort of rule because heaven has mastery over earth. So if we have heaven as our inheritance, we are sort of we're the true rulers on a different plane. But what I argue is that the heaven and earth never meet in Philo's view. It's sort of always with this tension of sort of, we're the true rulers, but the Romans are still ruling, but there's never going to be that sort of, his eschatology doesn't allow for that. Whereas Paul has a very different eschatology of Christ's return, and that ultimately the rulers of this present age are destined to perish. 1 Corinthians 2 and so on.
And in Paul is that already not yetness, that the inheritance is already ours, and yet it's not yet ceased. So
there is also that tension in Paul. There is also that tension of living in the already and the not yet. But there's a very clear future view of the rulers of this age. It's 1 Corinthians 2. Paul goes, he makes it very clear that he's not speaking about the wisdom of this age or the rulers of this age who are coming to nothing. He says, I'm paraphrasing now, but 1 Corinthians 2 is very interesting when it comes to Paul's view there. I also, in my PhD, I also argued that the idea of inheritance sort of lies behind a lot of Paul's discourse there, where he quotes from Isaiah, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, God has prepared for those who love him. That's sort of the language of inheritance, and it's specifically contrasted there to the rulers of this age who claim to be glorious, but ultimately they will be overthrown. And
what a comfort I find, it buys you so much time when you realize you actually have all of eternity, that whatever you don't get to hike now or scuba dive now or travel or see, or there's time. I found that such a comfort to know that there is time to still enjoy creation. Just do the work that's set before you to do now, and there'll be time.
That is liberating. I think it's very, very hard to live with that burden that you need to suck the marrow out of life. You have to do everything now, experience everything now. And yet I think C.S. Lewis was right, that there's a desire for a greater world, a better world, that even the best experiences, there'll still be something missing even in those best experiences. There's still a signpost looking towards the future. And it is liberating.
So, but in your understanding then better of how Paul approaches the idea of embodied space and then also future hope, for us right now, what is the right balance between ceasing what is, materially our inheritance and being excited for it and living with the material now, but then also, not loving the material unto death? It seems so difficult to find that correct balance, to not throw it all away because we have this weird Greek spiritual hope, but then also not to hang on to it for dear life because we have this great material hope. Where is home for the Christian? What is the correct theology of hope for us, for a Christian seeking home?
Yeah, I think those are really difficult questions, Leishan, and I think some of them are, must be worked out with with your own individual conscience. And I think we need Christian community to help us work out some of those questions and what they mean for us. And when am I becoming too attached? And should I have a holiday home by the sea because it's so beautiful and I can enjoy the creation there, or am I being extravagant there? Should I rather be investing that money elsewhere? I don't think those are easy questions to answer. One resource that I would recommend is Craig Bartholomew wrote a lovely book about 10 years ago called Where Mortals Dwell, a Christian view of place for today. And he addresses lots of these topics in more depth. I think we just constantly need to keep coming back to the big biblical story. God created place in the beginning. He put Adam and Eve in a particular place in the garden, and called them to cultivate it. And that was sort of a microcosm of the land of Israel as well, where if they lived under God's law, they would flourish. And then, of course, the incarnation as well is very important to keep in mind, that God himself entered into a particular place, a particular time in history, and dwelt among us. And so I think, the Christian should want to see place transformed around you. So I think, beginning in your own home, tidy your room in the morning, order just as God orders creation, to the degree that you can, sort of order your life. And you don't need a big house. In some ways, it's easier to order a small place, but an ordered place is more conducive to life. So, and practice hospitality. I think they're they're very big questions that need to be worked out in community, and we need to talk these things through, and not be too acquisitive. Recognize the idolatry in our own hearts, and how much do we need, and especially looking at the economic climate right now in South Africa. And I'm getting to that age where I'm actually starting to think, sort of 20 years down the line, how am I going to retire? All those kind of questions, and trusting God with many of those uncertainties. Listening to Jesus' words in Matthew 6 about each day having enough trouble of its own. Do what God says before us each day. I don't have too much more wisdom on that one. It's a big question.
That's very difficult, and especially, like you say, in the South African context. While you were reading and studying all these, Greek and Jewish scholars and thinkers, did your mind ever wander to the South African context? Did you encounter questions of how to think about land expropriation and land ownership, and especially colonization, such a big term and on the African continent now? What is a good theology of land in the context that we are in South Africa? How sentimental should we be? How ready to protect property? How ready to give up property? Where's the wisdom? What is a good theology of land ownership in the South African context?
Again, I think those are big questions, and we are sort of the biblical scholar in me is saying we're like crossing over to systematic theology here, and I'll let the systematic theologians handle that, so many of the ethical questions around there. But yes, no, those questions are always in the background. It is fascinating to go and look at some of the Old Testament laws around land, and letting the land lie fallow every Sabbath year, in order to allow the poor to glean from it. The land as a permanent inheritance. There's a certain kind of stability in the order there of having land. So I would say that the idea of private property is not necessarily an evil in itself. I think as Marx taught, I think there was private property ownership in ancient Israel, and I think a lot of Western civilization has this idea of property rights as being quite basic and necessary for human flourishing. You work hard to build something up. It's not right that others who haven't worked just simply get to share in that. It's an impossible ideal that everything belongs to the community, and not necessarily just either. So there are interesting ideas. The Jubilee year. If you've lost that sort of your land for whatever reason, that the land ownership gets restored. I think one can't just trace a line from there to any particular policy, but I think these things would be worthy of further reflection in our own context. I am grieve sometimes when I look at our own country, and you can perhaps blame some of the municipalities for not foreseeing land that needs to be developed, and what ends up happening is there's overcrowding, and then people just grab land, and it's often just the strong, or the really wealthy who have the means to quickly put up a shack that can't be taken down, and then not that they need that shack, then they rent that shack out to others. And so I think there should be some wise policy there to better control that, and have proper title deeds and so on for the land in our own country. I think those would all be wise things to consider implementing. Those are just a few thoughts.
Difficult. It's difficult topic. We have such an instinctual understanding of property ownership as human dignity. I think especially in an agrarian culture like in South Africa, there's something about land ownership that is so spiritual. I think we easily talk about deeds and just signing it over, but there's some spiritual need there that I find sometimes we struggle to express what the spiritual need is, and then it just comes out as, just give me land, I want to have a garden, and I want to have ownership. But I think it's a yearning for dignity, which we then personify or objectify in land ownership. But we need good thinkers in South Africa on this topic, because it's very
and I mean they're all there are some there's obviously a lot of reflection on this as well, and one has to understand the history as well. I think you mentioned expropriation. My understanding is that they've gone back to the Land Act of 1913, I think, and not further beyond. It obviously becomes difficult to trace the history further and further back. But I think another issue in our own country is we do need to deal with the past. Lots of people feel like we haven't adequately dealt with it, but how to deal with it is not easy. I think there's lots of discussions that need to take place.
I've also been thinking a lot about the digital space, and I always joke that I'm terminally online, and it's been fairly safe, because the distinction between the online and the physical, with the black mirror between us, has kept me fairly grounded. But I'm pretty nervous about the speed that the metaverse is ramping up, and I know it's not been so successful. People are laughing at Zuckerberg because the avatars don't have legs yet, but at the speed of AI and how quickly we are assimilating a type of transhumanism, I have to think more and more about physical space and my own ability to tolerate heat and cold and blood and sweat and exercise and just growing older and having to eat and things. So I was wondering, especially with you having been in formal ministry and having been responsible for church, COVID was such a difficult time for us. And we so quickly just adopted the workplace solutions also for the church solutions, just having Zoom and online meetings, and you and I are sitting here on an online meeting, just is so easy to record. And at KRUX, we reached a crossroads, because we were Zooming our talks on the KRUX Thursdays too, and we reached such an interesting point where the people in the lounge weren't exactly comfortable, because they always knew there was a microphone and a camera present, and the people on Zoom weren't having a great experience because we didn't have a studio set up with different camera angles and good mics. They just weren't really present. So we made that call at KRUX. We had to decide, let's keep the lounge so that the people present physically can have the best experience, and then let's move to the podcast format so that the people digitally can have a good experience. But what was your experience being responsible for a church, being the shepherd, the sheep are looking to you. They're looking to you for, why aren't we taking communion? Will we ever take communion again? Why aren't we singing together? How did you navigate that, and what was going through your mind about space and worship, and how has maybe this whole experience changed how you think about physical worship space?
Yeah, so I think we, out of necessity, we began to meet online during the lockdown, and we discovered these technologies, I think, in a new way. I think there are obvious benefits to, as you're saying, it's very convenient. You can meet very quickly, and you can do church with your slippers on, and with a cup of coffee in your hand. But there are also negatives. You can, while the preacher is making a key point in a sermon, you can get up and walk the toilet, and so switch off your video, and you can just be doing something else. You can be browsing your phone and sort of listening in the background. Your full attention is not there. We, as soon as we could, we met again in person, even though it was in smaller numbers, and singing where we could. So I think we all sensed the need to gather in person. Then of course the masks also became an issue. Do the masks hide our faces? And so we survived with masks for a while, but I think everybody was relieved when many of those restrictions were lifted again. And I think there was a breath of fresh air, and I think also a fresh appreciation for being able to gather in each other's physical presence and not just be meeting virtually. So I think there is, I think this whole exercise of the last few years has enabled us to appreciate our embodiedness more than we perhaps have, and the importance of the physical gathering, taking communion together, all those things, all those means of grace. I'm not so familiar with the most recent studies. About 6 months or a year ago, I heard lots of people saying, well, lots of people still haven't come back to church. People who before COVID, they were coming to church, and COVID sort of came, and now they just only join online. So I don't know what the statistics are on that. I'm guessing some more thorough studies will be coming out in the next year or two that actually explore the impact of the pandemic, of the whole pandemic, on the church. But from our own perspective, I think it has helped us appreciate the need for the physical gathering more. Yeah.
And do we even have a theology on the importance of physical space, or is it something that no first century Christian would even have been able to imagine, as meeting and not physically being present? Do we even have a theology?
I suppose so. I mean, I think it's interesting, in some of Paul's letters, he says, even though I'm not present with you in body, I am spiritually present, and I've already sort of pronounced judgment on the man who did this. And some scholars have sort of spoken of him as sort of having a presence via his letters, so that was obviously an earlier form of technology. It's not nearly as immediate as a Zoom call, but it is nevertheless a form of technology and a form of presence, verbal. He asked that his letters be read out in the churches and so on. So there is some sense of that, that you're not entirely limited to where you're physically present. I think we need to reflect on Jesus' words, particularly in the Upper Room Discourse, where he talks about the Spirit's coming. And he says, whoever believes in me will do what I have been doing, and it will do greater things, greater works, because I'm returning to the Father. And people have often speculated about that. Is it greater miracles? Is it more resurrections? And some people want to take it that way. But really, I think in terms of John's gospel as a whole, what Jesus is saying there is that the scope of his work won't be limited anymore by his physical presence. By the Spirit, he will be meeting wherever believers are, and he will be doing works wherever those who know him and who are indwelt by his Spirit are, following him and doing his works. That's where he will be present. And so, yeah, I think we need to reflect on that as well. Yeah.
I guess at the risk of being facetious, when we read the epistles, I guess it is in some way visiting Paul's YouTube channel, I guess, to go find out what he would have said about a topic, or to get a sermon from Paul.
Yeah. Yeah, why not?
In your talk, you then also said that, you know, I wrote down a quote from you. You said your relationship with authority is symbolized by your relationship with land, Jerusalem, and the temple. So now I was so interested in just asking, like, post PhD, how has your study informed your relationship with authority? Is that quote true of you, that you could see your relationship with authority in those three symbols?
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I've wrestled with this. I think because of my own background and my own experiences, how one thinks about authority, and yes, I think looking particularly at Paul, Paul is often used, and I think the feminist theologians often point this out, how he's often used to sort of enforce a kind of submission or obedience, because, you know, look what he says in Romans 13, you need to obey those in authority, or, you know, look what he says to wives, you know, submit to your husbands. And so just thinking through, you know, what was Paul's perspective on authority and how that worked, and in the church as well, and realizing that it's more nuanced than that. You know, you have to bring Romans 13 into conversation with 1 Corinthians 2, where he talks about, you know, the wisdom of God's wisdom is very different. You know, the wisdom of this age, you know, the rulers of this age crucified the Lord of glory, you know, and so there's always a line that you have to draw, and there's always, I think what's very liberating is seeing that in all the New Testament, and Paul particularly, it's always Christ who's the ultimate authority, and Christ always redefines authority, and that there's always a critique of all human authority. It always falls short. Yeah, I often go to places like Mark 10, you know, where Jesus talks about the rulers of the Gentiles who lord it over them, their high officials exercise authority over them, but not so among you. And really that reversal that Jesus brings, and I think we see that in Paul as well, that sort of upside down pyramid, that's actually, you know, that authority in the church ought to come from service, and I make some of those arguments as well in my thesis, from 1 Corinthians particularly. Paul always highlights those who have been serving the church as the leaders, and in 1 Corinthians 3, at the end there, he sort of talks about the sort of hierarchy of God, Christ, leaders, and then the people, but he sort of inverts it, you know, so actually the people belong to the church, or the leaders rather belong to the people, not the other way around. And in a sense, he puts the leaders in the church underneath the people. And so there's something of a congregational sort of view in Paul as well. And I try to bring some of that out as well. That must be held in tension. Of course, you know, he did also believe, you know, that there should be leaders in the local church who give it direction, but they're ultimately accountable to God. But also there's a degree of accountability to the church. And yeah, I think I've just seen in my own experience leaders who don't, you know, that of course everybody always says, yes, I'm accountable to God. But you're also accountable to the people. And I think Paul would also say that. And so, yeah, I think that was important for me to also see that, and sort of on the basis of the Bible, be able to challenge people who are not living out Jesus' vision of authority, who aren't serving or who are self-serving. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that'll be an interesting question to hold before you while you if we do read your book, to just see, you know, how does our attitude shift by greater understanding of these symbols. So if somebody does want to get a copy of your book, where is the easiest place to get it? How do we get a copy of your book?
Sure, I don't know. You can probably order online from Mohr Siebeck. It's very expensive. It's an academic book. This is what it looks like. This copy is, you know, one of my copies. But if you really want to read my book, I can give you, I can get a copy to you. But you can also order it online from Mohr Siebeck, German academic publisher. It is an academic book, so more technical. Maybe one day, if the Lord gives me the time, I might write a more popular level introduction on the same subject. I'm doing some research at the moment also on Josephus, another very important first century Jewish voice, and I'm also looking at his perspectives on authority. So maybe eventually I might have an opportunity to draw all this together and also do it at a more popular level, not a sort of not a technical academic level. Yeah.
If you have anything, the KRUX blog is always a good home for you if you want to leave something popular.
No, as soon as I have a little bit more time, I want to. I'll take that up. Take that opportunity up.
JP, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure my load shedding is going to kick in any second now, so let's immortalize this switch over as I'm left in the dark. But while I do have some electricity, thank you for your time, and thank you for your partnership with KRUX, and for just sharing your wealth of knowledge with us. Every time you've presented, we've grown. So thank you. There's another talk of yours also on the YouTube channel. So anybody that wants to see more of Dr. Harper, you can just browse the channel and you'll find some more talks of him. And yeah, if you stumbled upon this podcast, and then please come visit us in the lounge, KRUX Thursdays. Mail me at lishan@krux.africa. I see I forgot to change James' name on my video, so I'm not called James. That's James Crone, the director of KRUX. I'm Lishan. Otherwise, you can visit us at krux.africa for more information. And yeah, JP, thank you so much for your evening.
It's a pleasure.
For your time.
Thank you for having me.
Right. See you in the lounge soon again.
Good night.